All right, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you. So we've got a great panel here today, and before we get started, there was supposed to be one more panelist, actually the moderator, and she couldn't be here today due to a family emergency, so I've stepped up as a panelist and a moderator. To a great extent, we'll be self-moderating ourselves, but the intent is to really have a good interactive session, and feel free to chime in, and I'll seek some of the inputs from the audience as we go. But as you know, the topic is, so I represent the water space, which is why the topic is from water to lighting and data to democratize public infrastructure. There's a whole lot to unpack within that topic. And so before we get started, I'd like to take a brief moment just to introduce our panelists. To my right is Stephen Goldsmith, and he's got an exemplary career, and I'm going to try to summarize it. Served as the former deputy mayor, district attorney, publisher of several books, so an author, and most recently, most recent is he's a professor of practice at urban policy and the director of Data Smart City Solutions at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And as we go, I'll try to make some of the connections between his former positions and role in government and public-private partnerships. He's been an advisor to the President Bush campaign, and also advised nonprofits and faith partnerships to President Bush. So, having that career that he's been in and connecting it to the topic today is going to be extremely interesting. To Steve's right is Miguel Sangalang. Did I pronounce that right? And Miguel is also got a very rich experience, worked with Mayor Garcetti. Now he's the executive director and general manager for the Bureau of Street Lighting for the city of Los Angeles, overseeing a system of over 220,000 street lighting infrastructure. And I think the connectors here would be, his experience with in industry and kind of operationalizing, bringing to practice this concept of smart cities and what does it really mean, and what are the connectors between utilities that eventually make up smart cities. So, their bios are all online. I'd like to get into the conversations, but we've got some great, presence here. Very briefly, my background is in the water space. I was leading a $7.5–8 billion infrastructure program in Miami-Dade. So Miami is home for me. And we are ground zero, as you know, from climate change and sea level rise. And the infrastructure program was huge. But most recently, my role has been changed, where I've been appointed by Mayor Levine Cava, who you must have heard on main stage right before this one, to lead water strategy issues for Miami-Dade County. So basically from a standpoint of extreme rain, flooding, precipitations, but we are a system of 34 cities, and bringing it all together, connecting to the smart cities concepts and data and governance. I think that those would be the areas that we would be wanting to navigate today. So with that, Steve, I think I'd like to turn to you as kind of an opening statement. Is we are at the Smart Cities Expo, and we understand what it is, and in my mind, services, whether it's housing or infrastructure or transportation or lighting or utilities like water, when they are smart, cumulatively a city is smart. And help us unpack Smart City 101 from your vision in your role in government and advising former presidents, and your most current role. How do you see that unfolding in cities from your vantage point?
Thanks for the question. In the audience, you should recognize we have an expert practitioner on my left, an expert practitioner on my right. I'm a retiree, just talks about this stuff, so I'm going to defer mostly to them. Let me answer the question very briefly in the following way, right? So I've worked in cities for a long time, and cities have public works departments or water departments, they have street lighting departments, they have fill in the blank sanitation departments, right? But people live at 10th and Main, right? They don't live in a department. They live in a place. And that means that we need to find data, smart city data, if you will, that allows government to operate interactively with its residents, but in a way that's place-based. And what we have some danger of is that our agencies have become smarter because they have a lot more digital information. But do they use that information to interact with the public and deliver services on their terms, or are they using that information just to be more efficient, right? And it's good to be more efficient, but it's insufficient. So we'll start with kind of that proposition. The second proposition I would say is if we think about the title today, we have smart infrastructure in the way that Hardeep mentioned, but how do we aggregate the smart information in a way that allows us to iterate the way we operate? So we can use digital tools to involve the public in the planning of the investment with respect to infrastructure. I've got a couple, if we have time, we've got a couple examples from New York City in that regard. But we can also continue to collect the data that allows us to modify the usage of that infrastructure for purposes of dynamically changing it to meet the needs of the community. Think of, is the sidewalk a sidewalk for parking, or is it a sidewalk for scooters, or is it a place for outdoor cafes, or should it be a green space? And do we want to make a decision today with all of these billions of dollars of infrastructure that's fixed in time, or do we want to use IoT sensors and the like to collect data that allows us to change the utilization and allocation of that infrastructure? So I would just say very briefly, we're overwhelmed with digital opportunity. We have more digital opportunity for digital transformation than ever before, but it sits on top of a very archaic form of government. So how do we manage that data to allow us to be more responsive and dynamic and iterative? Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Steve. And on that note, I was reading on my way in terms of how much data we are really generating, and I resorted to Google because it's the largest data repository, right? I believe it's 2.5 quintillion bytes of data on a daily basis. That's 18 zeros behind 2.5. So somewhere in that vicinity on a daily basis, that's the amount of data. I like to call it infobesity, where there's so much of data that comes our way, and how do you navigate it and how you don't become victims of garbage and garbage out syndrome. So with that note, Miguel, I'd like to turn to you here, is you really are in the front and center in operationalizing the work, right? I mean, the rubber hits the road as far as you're concerned. You're managing the infrastructure currently from a standpoint of street lighting, right? What were some of the lessons you've learned? Where are you heading with it? And where do you see the connectors in smart lighting, smart infrastructure from a standpoint of street lighting? How do you see that overlapping with other services in Los Angeles?
Sure. I'll say a couple things, and I wanted to just react to what Stephen said really briefly. Also, good morning, everybody. I wanted to react to what Stephen said because I think there's already been examples where it has been successful with either what government has published or used. I mean, very basic one that the federal government did, NOAA-weather.com, right? Super useful. Things that we're doing around utilities and just providing consumer information and time of use for electrical data and water consumption. Those have been driving factors for us in Los Angeles to try and conserve water and energy in certain times, right? So things that we're giving consumers, et cetera, that are already kind of affecting behaviors and changing certain things from that perspective of how it works then with a larger grid, for example. But I think we're stopping a little bit short, right? So there's, to your point, a back and forth on that can actually develop that even further and make it so that it's far more interactive, far more useful for policy setting and absorbing some of this information. So I think that's places that we have to kind of double down. From my perspective, there's a few different things that I'd probably add in that, we're actually still, even though we have lots of data, sometimes some of that is actually junk. So we're still trying to even refine some of the things that we're collecting and using, because garbage in, garbage out, that'd be some of the things that we're facing, right? So we are still in the search for some very useful nuggets of information. We're expanding networks of pieces of infrastructure on expanding systems on pieces of our infrastructure like what we're doing in Los Angeles, air quality sensors, more water sensors, et cetera, that are helping us then guide some policies. And to that point, we actually had, for real-time code side management, something that we're piloting called Code the Curb. And so that's putting sensors, cameras, and other things on our street lights, working with our Department of Transportation to change what is very static. I mean, it only changes when you either paint the curb, put someone specifically there to direct traffic. Those are the only times that the right-of-way really changes, right? But what happens if you start using lights, other sensors to change what would be painted on the curb, theoretically, and make it so that you can have deliveries at certain times or other types of residential uses, dining, et cetera. So some of those pieces, I think, are what we're all exploring. Some fairly nascent, right, for how we're actually using that information data. And I think other places where we have to really, really double down because we already have a connection with residents, right? And those are places that we can refine more, really try and get greater engagement and try and transform some of the things that we're doing.
Thank you. To carry on to that conversation, as we talk about more data coming our way, we also always talk about data existing in silos. And I think, Steve, you talked about being efficient from a standpoint of being able to aggregate data versus being able to glean information from it. And the word I'm looking for is the art of digital storytelling, right? Because at the end of the day, technocrats, me included sometimes, then we become administrators. And, from an educational perspective, we are going there in terms of data scientists and chief data officers, but that level of sophistication in terms of understanding has to kind of pervade through an organization into the workforce. And I want to come to your book that you wrote on workforce. We'll come to that in a minute. I guess the question that I'm trying to drive is too much data exists in silos, and we have a dual responsibility, meaning we in government have a responsibility, to serve our customers, our consumers, us included, but also to advise policy and frameworks and that drive new legislations and ordinances. And if we don't, how do we find a way to really improve upon that art of digital storytelling in simple English, right? Because you've got data in bytes and graphs and charts and all kinds of Power BI tools and analytics, but then the common man needs to get that information in much more simpler terms. Who is that bridge, in your opinion, from your current role at Harvard? How do you see that unfolding?
This is absolutely terrific question. And let me answer it with a couple quick stories. So open data that's not well visualized is not really open data at all. And so if we look at the title of today's session and Hardeep's terrific question, then one of the challenges and obligations of government is to visualize its information around an issue. It could be a meta tag in terms of a geography, or it could be an issue that allows for engagement, and it captures the engagement in a way that iterates the decision making. So just really quickly, a couple examples. When I was deputy mayor of New York, we started mapping the 311 calls, as you can figure out. And if I had a PowerPoint, you'd see yellow dots, and the size of the yellow dot is the number of calls we got at that corner, right? So then I told the agencies I was going to hire 2 master's students from Columbia to go around and teach the community boards about how to use the software that we were using to map the dots. And the agencies said, oh my God, we get enough complaints, so you're really going to help them complain to us even more. But what happened, of course, is that when the community board president saw the dots and drilled inside the dot, what happened to this complaint? Why was this complaint made? How long did it take to resolve? They would start to call back and say, I'll just give you a real quick example. One community board president said, you know why we have so many near misses for pedestrians at this corner? It's because you've got an old folks home on one corner and a pharmacy on the other, and your transportation engineers will not change the time of the walk wait signs. right? So here's how, and so it was the visualization of that data that allowed that information to be captured and then transferred. And so your question is the essence of democratized public infrastructure and data. How do you visualize it? How do you use it? How do you tell a story with the maps? You know, people experience things where they live, and they have insights where they live, and that's the beauty of the mapping.
This is great, and I think, you know, the younger generation is all about social media and, you know, the creator economy, and my daughter is actually, shameless plug, she's in the middle of all of this. And quite a lot of takeaways that come from the younger generation in terms of, you know, how are they absorbing information? How are we preparing them for becoming a workforce of the future? Because that learning curve really has to be steepened in terms of what we are absorbing in the industry versus what are they going to inherit? And then, of course, the community aspect of it. Miguel, from your standpoint, in terms of democratizing data, right? That's the whole conversation here. In your viewpoint, how do you see that? And how is the community in the city of Los Angeles connecting to the data that you're generating as streetlights? But I think it'll be nice to understand the ecosystem within government and outside of government, and what are those connectors in terms of how are you engaging in that digital storytelling effort?
Yeah, so I'll say two things, and I'll first state one, which is hiring. And actually bringing people on board that know some of these things, and having different pathways for us to bring people from the community. So we have targeted local hire, we have our Bridge to Jobs program. Those are entry level, but some of these have been also promoting into administrative jobs into the city. So we have different pipelines that are going to be some of these people that are creating some of these visualizations. I think that's very important. Not only from the very top where you have the C-suite, but all the way down, because it's going to be a department manager or sub-manager that's going to be doing some of these things that are interesting in order for us to actually connect to our residents. So that's going to be very important. I think there's probably more to double-click in there. But the other piece is, I don't think governments have to have the answers ourselves there. This is 100% where our partners with universities and other civic technology, either groups or leaders, are very useful. So we've done things in Los Angeles like have a data federation. So we've actually signed MOUs with 12 different universities around the city in order for us to work with them on projects that they might be using for student purposes or even questions that we're trying to answer, right? So some of these things are the infrastructure that we're trying to build in order to create some of these visualizations. And then other very focused kind of groups and individuals, we call them data angels. They're essentially volunteers that are looking to be part of the solution for certain questions. And I think there's another piece when we're talking about problems. I think there's a huge opportunity, especially around what was just talked about in the previous plenary about IIJA and the dollars coming in. I mean, a question I'm going to have very specifically is, where do I put EV chargers? If I can do it at half the cost of some of the federal estimates, if I do it myself, where should it go? How do we engage the public in that? Is it actually a good thing? Do they believe it's a good thing? How would these placements actually affect some of the businesses and other things that we would want to start diving into and sharing our information? I can place at least my street lights there, show air quality and pollution, other factors that might be useful in trying to determine some of these, because some of these grant programs that are coming up are going to need community components and advocacy for it in order for you to get the funding. It's all competitive.
So are we allowed to ask you questions?
Absolutely.
Because you're just supposed to be a panelist.
There you go, right? We're self-moderating. Absolutely.
Let me just flip the question briefly, because you're a leader in water. So another way to think about data is using the data you have to change the behaviors of your customers, your consumers, right? How much electricity do they consume? How much water do they consume? What do you do with digital metering information? So how are you thinking about using information to change the behaviors of your consumers?
Yeah, great question. So, water and energy, as we know, there's a nexus, right? Makes water to make energy, takes energy to make water. And it goes beyond that in terms of the contaminants we're seeing in water today. We've seen what's happening around the world, for that matter, around the country. And we are going to be embarking very soon in smart metering of our infrastructure. It's going to be a 5-year project, almost about $250 million. And the way we see it is, data, again, if it's not in silos, you want to be able to not just change the experience of the consumer to say, well, you're getting a digital bill and your experience is better, just like those Nest Energy devices at home. But it needs to go beyond that in terms of conservation, in terms of also ensuring that we are connecting the dots between water and wastewater and stormwater, because the industry jargon is one water. And there's still not any national framework, so that's an opportunity for us to say, well, if you're looking at a smart utility, a utility provides services related to water and wastewater. And if you follow that one drop of water in the life cycle, which we've all learned in grade school, called the water cycle, that water drop doesn't really exist in reality as water and wastewater and stormwater. It just takes on different forms as it traverses through the water cycle. So I think what we are trying to do, at least the aspiration that I have, is to change the consumer behavior to say, let's not look at water in different silos, because it doesn't really exist in nature from the time it's abstracted from the ground all the time till it's returned back into the ground, whether you treat it or reuse it. And I think that experience then becomes more holistic, more comprehensive, if you're able to connect the data between all the different domains, including the water where it came from, because, let's face it, less than 1% of fresh water on planet Earth is really fit for human consumption. This is for 7.8 billion people today and 10 billion people by the year 2050. So behavior changes. We are talking of an emerging contaminant in water today called PFAS. It's being regulated, but there's no detection limits or methods still to standardize or test it. Now, the pandemic has taught us that water is a global resource from a supply chain logistics standpoint, so we don't really live in a resiliency bubble, so to speak, that in Miami-Dade, if we become smart and we do everything, we are good. That's really not the intent, right? So I think it's a global conversation, and to the extent we can connect the dots of data in different silos, I think it would be a bigger bang for the buck we'll be spending. I'm going to switch the question to your last remark, Miguel, and I think in the context of everything you both have described, one of the opportunities is on innovation, and the word innovation also is loaded, right? What does it really mean? Innovation, the most simplistic sense, could be a change in process, or it could be a new technology to operationalize it. Steve, my question to you is the book that you've written on social innovation and I believe governance, and both of those two words are probably another panel conversation of its own. But how do we connect the dots of data, democratizing data, to social innovation from a standpoint of inclusivity? Because I think if the general public and the general community at large understands what we are trying to do, either from a policy standpoint or from a governmental standpoint, then you're kind of encouraging greater participation and greater ideas and that social innovation ecosystem. Do you see more opportunities there? Do you see things happening? Are there any examples you can share?
Well, let me answer quickly in two different ways. Well, actually, let me talk about McGill as part of my answer. But pre-McGill and post-McGill as CAO of the City of Los Angeles, right? So before McGill was there, where Mayor Garcetti, with the urging of the LA Times, mapped the cleanliness of the sanitation department. What was the name of the department? Sanitation? Yeah. Mapped the work of the sanitation department, their grades on sanitation against the demographics of the neighborhoods, found that the neighborhoods with more condensed poverty had worse sanitary conditions on the inspection. So when you saw the map, the color of the block segments was much worse where folks were less wealthy, right? That drove changes in how the city, and Miguel was CAO after that, resolved the distribution of city services. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to think about the following. LA also had the GIS coding of all of its open data. So it's GIS coded open data. If you looked at that map and you said, how do you use social innovation, that means that the nonprofit players, the individual players, the consumer, the government, the county, right there, they all interact. And so to the extent that the open data is a platform for engagement and collaboration, it's another way to drive value.
Thank you. Miguel, from your standpoint, one of the things that I always get confronted with, or at least it's an aspirational ask for myself, is, in the county, we are 34 cities, Miami-Dade. And there is this topic on governance, and governance drives how data is going to be collected, how data is going to be aggregated and assimilated, and then how is it going to be shared from a standpoint of digital storytelling, kind of trying to bring it all together. What has been your experience in bringing together stakeholders from multiple dimensions who hold different kinds of data, and how have you brought it together, or are there any efforts in that smart city ecosystem that you're working towards? It is. I know part of it is a complicated question, and I think this might be also for Steve to chime in as we piggyback on this. Is it even feasible? Is it even doable? Is it too much data? Are we being too aspirational as a community, as a city? Because we talk about it. Just the water system, right? 34 cities, just to name a few agencies, the Department of Environmental Protection, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Army Corps, the Department of Health, the county, the 34 cities, infrastructure data, climate data, sea level rise data, all of this comes together. And then you have the economic data, investments data, population growth, sensors. Is it too much to do it? Do we need to do it? Does that really define smart cities, or is it happening?
I'll answer with one of my favorite responses that a person had told me, Beth Blauer, who used to do Maryland and Baltimore's ComSat. Donuts are incredibly powerful. And what I mean by that is there's probably very easy ways that are not immediate. If you're trying to answer a very charged question, like trying to improve quality of life for certain things, then I think the immediate response is to dig in and focus on what your job is. If you start off in a way that is looser or more engaging, at least at the department level and staff level, you will probably get far more out of the different types of data and collaboratives that you can do than any kind of strict mandate. Although strict mandates are also very powerful tools. I'm just trying to underscore the fact that you will need many throughout the organization to actually take ownership of that data and share it and say that I have important things. And sometimes you might not even know it's important. That's the other thing, right? This is where the donut comes in, whereas actually, can you just tell me a little bit of what you have there? And, and then use it as a bartering, I guess, tool to try and get some of that information out there. So that, I think, is some of the places where, you will probably want to start in areas, if you're trying to build it organically, if you're trying to create systems, start in ways that are a little bit less demanding of a requirement, such as the LA Times investigating you and trying to figure out whether you're doing something improperly or not, right? So I'll stop there, because I'm pretty sure Stephen will have a reaction to that.
I'd love to get Steve's viewpoint on it.
No, I don't have much to add to Miguel's answer. I actually think the overwhelming amount of information that is available is a reason why you don't want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Yeah. You don't need every data set. You need to have a practical, stories. When I was early on, Bloomberg Philanthropy gave a grant to the city of Chicago to set up, at the time, one of the first data analytics centers after kind of what we did in New York. And a very competent woman was in charge of that, and she was trying to convince the agencies to share data. but they didn't care, right? And then she said, give me a problem that you think I can help solve. And the sanitation department said, we have too many rats. So how do you help us identify and predict where we're going to have a rat outbreak? And she said, well, here's what we can do. And we got a bunch of data, lighting data, trash pickup, and they solved the rat problem. So the rat problem is the answer to the data problem, right? Which is, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And the fact that there are all of these agencies, and there are almost that many agencies involved in half the problems that a city faces, is the reason we need data platforms with shared data and ability to get at it and democratize data in order to empower more players at the table to participate. So this is the problem, but it's also the answer.
Thank you. And I think the question, I think, follow-up to that is, when we want to amplify a message, we talked about storytelling, and whether the message is for a problem that we are facing or a new budget issue that we want to pass because we want to take it through our policymakers and elected officials. If there's one language that you think can unify community, elected officials, policymakers, bureaucrats, technocrats, everybody, do you believe that data could be that unifying language? Or if it isn't, what do you think we should be doing to unify conversations?
I'll give Miguel the last word this time. So I think that data visualized and usable could be the unifying language. I mean, just to tell two really quick stories, 30 seconds each. I got elected mayor of Indianapolis. I went out to cut a ribbon in a park that my predecessor had designed and built, but I wanted to take credit for it because I got elected. I went out there to cut the ribbon, and this lady comes up and goes, the basketball courts are on the wrong side of the park. You have them on the side of the park where the senior citizens sleep at night. They should have been on the other side. So I raised a bunch of money for new parks in the city of Indianapolis. I went out to my first community meeting and said, what do you want in your park? And the guy stood up and said, you've got the park planners. Why are you asking us what should be in the park? Show us the options and we'll respond to it, right? 3 years ago, I wrote an article about Mayor Pete when he was mayor of South Bend. He raised $50 million for new parks in South Bend. He put up like SMS signboards and visualized options in the parks and asked for people for input. So data visualized can be the answer for participation, but it can't be just a jump ball and it can't be all data.
So just to be clear, when you say data visualize, the precursors before visualization is, first of all, like Miguel, you said data collection, data aggregation. Are we mining the right data? Do we really need it? Is there governance behind it? Is the data repeatable? There's a methodology behind it. All of those elements have to be in place so that when the visualization happens to digital storytelling, we are not victims of garbage in, garbage out. Am I capturing that correctly, Steve? From your standpoint in terms of storytelling, and Miguel?
Well, so let me react to what Stephen said, because I 100% agree that visualization is the unifying factor there. But a sub-bullet of that is geospatial, right? Like, that is what's going to matter. What's in my neighborhood? How does that affect me? How does that translate to things that are around me? So capturing that information in that way is going to be highly, highly important for decision-making, basically forevermore.
Good, thank you. I want to quickly segue a bit. If there's any thoughts, comments, questions from the audience at this point, I think it'll be a great injection. Yes, ma'am.
How are you sure that the method that you're using to create visualization is inclusive as opposed to exclusive? What are the symbols? What's the methodology for designing the interface for visualization?
All right, let me paraphrase the question. What's the method to design the interface for data visualizations to make sure that you're being inclusive in that approach? Did I capture that correctly?
Designers may not understand what the community needs to see.
Got you. So bridging the gap between the designers who probably sometimes are victims and guilty of operating in our own kingdoms versus truly what the community really needs, and are we really addressing it from a standpoint of visualization? Great question, because sometimes we become so bogged down in our own little visualization tools, say, oh wow, this looks so cool, but is it really, like Steve said, you might aggregate all the data, are you really telling the story, are you really connecting the dots? Steve, I'll defer that question to you.
Well, this is like a 3-hour question. We have 2 minutes and 55 seconds left. So I think, just to be respectful to your question, every one of our answers, especially every one of my answers, is a two-sided coin, right? Accurate information for changing behaviors has the risk of privacy, right? Algorithms have the risk of algorithmic bias. So I think we should acknowledge that there's no simple answer to any of these questions. One way to approach your question is to make sure the right folks are at the table in challenging how you're doing it in the first place, and then you iterate it, right? Because and Miguel made this point, it's all about GIS, but in a sense it's all about context. So if the context of the people configuring the context is all one-sided, they're going to miss the point of the issue. And you can think about a lot of that in the articles written about algorithmic bias. It's not the algorithm that's biased, it's the original collection of data on which the algorithm trains, and the same is true here, right? So visualization needs to be fair, and that means it needs to be designed with a broader number of folks at the table. Really great question.
You know, I'll just take a moment to share a little bit of Miami-Dade, since I have to, you know, I think it's only appropriate for me to be here in Miami, so just bring it home. You know, Mayor Levine Cava, when she started, she had 4 E's, and one of them was on equity, environment, economy. The fourth one was engagement. And I think, to answer your question, and like Steve said, there's really no method to the madness, but partly it might be a top-down, bottom-up approach. I'm sharing this from the way Mayor Levine Cava led it here is, you know, she came with the vision to say, we've got to build inclusivity and equity. Now, how do you go about doing that? Well, she came out with some strategies: a sea level rise strategy, a Thrive 305 strategy, a climate action strategy, and they're all actually available on the website. So a lot of the leadership across the 25 departments came together, nonprofits, industry, academic partners, experts. We all came together, connected the dots with the communities, right? Built the indicators around it to say, okay, what are the issues there? Because, you know, we all have it in our own little kingdoms, depending on where we come from, whether you're a technocrat or a bureaucrat or academician. So bringing those together in this document that is sustainable over leadership after leadership, sustainable over administrations, so that it doesn't change and confuse the communities. So once that is done, then the mantle shifts to the 25 departments to say, all right, you've all bought into this now, that there was a community engagement behind it. And then I think there's a journey to this process, both from a resiliency standpoint and from a data standpoint, because nothing stops. It's a continuous improvement process. We are getting bombarded with new challenges on a daily basis and new data on a daily basis. So I think that is where I think we are headed towards, and I hope that answers your question. I know we are out of time. Any last thoughts, Miguel? Parting comments? What is LA heading up to, and what's next in the excitement horizon for you? And Steve, for you the same? Start with you, Miguel.
Well, I think there's a lot to be seen still. And so there's going to be more that people are going to be engaged and being part of this. I think that's what everyone's trying to crack the nut on with regards to community engagement and civic engagement. That's going to be fascinating as it rolls out.
Thank you.
It seems to me the opportunity and the risk is when we're spending all this infrastructure money, are we also spending it on digital infrastructure? And how do we utilize that digital infrastructure to actually be responsive to the community and make our cities more equitable and sustainable? That won't come from building infrastructure like we have been building it the last 20 years.
Thank you both. And I'd really want to thank you first for being here, right? It's important to take away so many things happening here. And please give it up for this great panel here. Thank you.